Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar with the School for CEOs, Becoming an Inclusive Leader. We've got quite a range of people and organisations signed up to join us today on the webinar, including a large number of HR, talent, diversity specialists, and also chief executives, managing directors and senior executive leaders. So welcome to you all. And it's great to see a mixture of alumni, faculty, and also some new names on that sign-up list. So welcome to you all. I hope that you're all safe and in good health. My name is Gemma Sole. I'm a director at School for CEOs, and once again today I have the privilege of hosting the webinar. Also on the line we have our managing partner leading today's presentation, David Sole. Hello, David.
Good afternoon, Gemma. Hope you're well.
Right now, the spotlight is on our leaders, perhaps more so than ever before, be they our political leaders, scientific, business, or even the leaders of our own households. And we're putting our trust in these leaders in the hope that they will see us through uncertain and difficult times. And this platform that leaders now have offers them a fantastic opportunity to step up to the plate and to set the foundations for a truly inclusive approach to leadership when they do emerge from this current situation. That's all from me at the moment. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to David, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. David.
Thanks, Gemma, and welcome everyone. I hope you are all safe and well. Well, thank you very much for joining us this Friday lunchtime. What I'd like to do this afternoon is talk a little bit about diversity, what it really is, and whether the mechanisms that organizations are putting in place are actually helping to increase it. Then we're going to turn our attention to inclusion, which we believe is the real game changer for organizations. We're going to try and get under the skin of inclusive leadership and what the characteristics of inclusive leaders are, and in particular, how can you develop them? Then hopefully we'll have a chance to do a Q&A before we let everyone head into their weekend. I think there are three types of diversity. There is obvious and apparent diversity. This is diversity that everyone can see. Its elements, such as gender, and in this case I mean biological gender rather than gender identity, race and ethnicity, age, physical disability. And then there's what I term superficial diversity. You need to dig a little bit further, but the differences may not lie too far below the surface. This is where gender identity and expression comes in. Religion, national origin, sexual orientation, education, cultural perspectives, your parental status, income, education, background, and so on. And finally, there is invisible diversity. That is to say, those differences that are not immediately obvious or transparent. This is where you have to explore more deeply to discover what variations really exist. What are people's upbringing? Do they have single or married parents? What are people's personal belief systems, be they political beliefs, attitude to work, attitude to risk, family situation, money, competition? Your value set. What are the things that are really important to you? What is your thinking style? How do you approach decision making? Whether there are any mental or learning disabilities, and indeed your leadership style. Let's compare and contrast these six politicians, who I'm sure you'll recognize, but I'll run through them in any case. On the top row from left to right, we've got Boris Johnson, Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, and on the bottom line from left to right, we've got Ruth Davidson, David Mundell, and Theresa May, and I've looked for their very best photographs, you'll notice. Let's have our first poll, Gemma. I'd like you to vote yes if you think the group is diverse, or no if you think the group isn't diverse. And I'm sure we'll all have our own reasons for voting in a particular way, and that's absolutely okay. Okay, so that's 60-40, 60% thinking that the group is quite diverse and 40% thinking the group isn't diverse. Okay, well, let's explore a little bit further and dig a little bit into the different aspects of diversity. Let's start with superficial diversity. And I'm only going to take a couple of aspects. This is by no means an exhaustive list. If we look at gender, and in this instance, again, I'm talking about biological gender and ethnicity, there is some obvious and apparent diversity. We have 3 men and 3 women. From an ethnic perspective, there are 2 women of Asian origin, in fact, with their roots originally in India. Priti Patel's parents came to the UK via Uganda, where they'd moved to from India, while Rishi Sunak's grandparents were born in the Punjab and immigrated to the UK from East Africa as well in the 1960s. The other 4 are Caucasian. Let's dig a bit further and consider a couple of aspects of superficial diversity. If we look at education and sexual orientation, the diversity is less obvious. There were actually 3 people state educated, 2 educated privately, and the last one was sent to a grammar school. 5 people went in the group went to Russell universities, while Priti Patel went to Keele University. And as far as sexual orientation is concerned, Ruth Davidson and David Mundell are both homosexual. David Mundell came out some 4 years ago in 2016, while the others are in heterosexual relationships. Finally, let's look at 2 aspects of invisible diversity in regard to political beliefs and physical and mental health. All of the folk are Tories, they're all in the Conservative Party, but they voted 50-50 Leave Remain in the Brexit referendum. Ruth Davidson has spoken openly about her mental health problems, while Theresa May is diabetic. Now, I don't know if the others have any underlying mental or physical health problems, as often these aren't disclosed. Let's have another poll, Gemma, if we may. With all of this additional information and understanding a little bit more about the differences and or similarities in the 6 individuals, have your views changed on how diverse the group is? So there's 3 options there. You can say, actually, this group is more diverse than I first thought. Your opinion hasn't changed, or actually the group is less diverse than I first thought. Okay. So 60%, in the first poll, there was a 60-40 split. So actually, we've got 30% actually changing their mind, thinking it's more diverse, 11% think is less diverse, and 60% of the group saying that the opinion hasn't changed with the additional information. Okay, so a third of people have, well, 40%, 41% have changed their minds from the first vote. Okay, thanks, Gemma. Close that one off. People have different ways of thinking, and that is what you really want in the room. In essence, what we're looking for is cognitive or neurodiversity, and 7 of the most common types of thinking are up on the slide. They're all very different, and I'm sure you'll recognize some of these as preferred thinking styles in some of your colleagues. Creative thinkers may often find the analytical thinkers quite challenging, and vice versa. Similarly, the divergent thinkers are at the opposite end of the spectrum to the convergent thinkers. But that is what you're looking for. It's the application of different approaches to problem solving and decision making. No one thinking style is better or worse than another. It's just different. So to nurture and embrace diversity, you want people who will come at problems from a different viewpoint to your own. It's diversity of thought that really counts. How that is packaged, be it gender, race, age, sexuality, upbringing, or whatever, is of less relevance. But we currently seem to be focusing on diversity that we can touch and see, because firstly, it's the most obvious thing, bar none, and secondly, there are some fundamental differences that do emerge through gender, cultural upbringing, religion, and so on. So it's probably the easiest place to start. Now, this webinar isn't about gender diversity, but there are still more FTSE CEOs who are called Dave and Steve than there are women. And for those of you who are a good bit younger than me and not into the Foo Fighters, those pictured on the left are Dave Grohl and Steve McQueen. And of course, on the right, there's Alison Rose, who's CEO at RBS, and Emma Walmsley, CEO at GSK. And going back to the point about fundamental differences that gender diversity brings, We know that from an evolutionary biological perspective, women have a lower risk appetite than men. So you will have a different risk profile in decision making depending on how many women you have in the room at any one time. Now, if you'd like to know more about this, Dr. Mari McLeod's podcast on this subject is on the School for CEO's website, and it's well worth listening to. And if we look at two other areas where women are underrepresented, government and the arts, we know that in the UK, the analysis of the impact that female MPs have had since 1945 shows that women are more likely to speak about women's issues, as well as family policy and care in Parliament, than men are. While in media and the arts, female journalists are significantly more likely to centre a female's perspective and to quote women. Women in the film industry are more likely to employ women, which is needed, because in children's films released between 1990 and 2005, only 28% of speaking roles went to female characters, and women made up only 17% of crowd scenes, which clearly isn't the world that we live in today. And there's a very good commercial argument for organizations to be more diverse. Gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform their peer group, while ethnically diverse organizations are 35% more likely to outperform their peers. So it's good for business, but it also impacts on human lives, which just makes it the right thing to do. The bottom 2 points really quantify the business benefit here. In the US, the link between racial and ethnic diversity and better financial performance is clear. For every 10% increase in racial and ethnic diversity on the senior executive team, EBIT rose by 0.8%. The change is more staggering in the UK. There are some clear benefits for gender diversity. For every 10% increase in gender diversity, there is an EBIT increase of 3.5%. Yet there is still the bigger moral question and rationale for more diverse organizations that truly reflect the societies that we live in. So what are organizations doing? Well, there's a tendency for businesses to focus on tangible targets. What gets measured gets done. So many organizations are setting targets around diversity. This, coupled with the fact that there are some legislative requirements, such as gender pay gap reporting, are increasing the drive to action. We can see businesses looking at the minority groups, segmenting them, and then applying targets on those various groupings, whether it's gender, ethnicity, social mobility, age, or whatever. And this is creating a drive to action. Or is it? If we look now at what organizations are doing about this, there's a bit more of a mixed picture. There are a whole range of processes that businesses are implementing. A survey of 400 of the largest companies in the UK broke these activities down. As you can see, flexible working was by far the most popular across these organizations, with 55% of the businesses that were surveyed having flexible working practices in place. I'm sure that number will be significantly greater post the COVID-19 crisis. But it's interesting to note how quickly the activity drops off. Some of the highlights for me were that only 10% of companies insisted on balanced shortlists. Only 7% of organizations actually had a D&I function, and just over 10% had put diversity targets in place, which slightly contradicts my previous point. So you can see there was quite a wide range of activity taking place across these large organizations in the UK. But even with the activity, a report in 2019 undertaken by the Boston Consulting Group cast a shadow of doubt about the effectiveness of these processes. Now, this report suggested that the success of programs was seriously questionable. Approximately 98% of companies had established gender diversity programs, but only a quarter of employees in the diverse groups indicated that they had benefited from these programs. And when they looked into what was holding things back, a couple of other key points struck us. A key impediment is men aged 45 and older, and a focus on implementation exemplified by strong leadership commitment and actions tailored to drive change was key, in particular balancing top-down and bottom-up initiatives. Now, this report looked at all aspects of diversity beyond simply gender. So we would argue that the first statement, the one about men aged 45 and older, is probably true for pretty much all minority groups. And to really drive change, while this has to be a leader-led activity, it was no surprise to us that if you truly want to make a difference, you have to act at all levels in an organization. So let's turn our attention to inclusive leadership and what that all means. For us, this means cultural change, enabling a different, more complete and engaging style of leadership. Now, I like the CIPD definition from the perspective of work, but before we look at this, we have to remember that inclusivity is for everyone. It's not just for minority populations, and it's a societal issue, not just an organizational one. Inclusion is the extent to which everyone at work, regardless of their background, identity, or circumstance, feels valued, accepted, and supported to succeed at work. Inclusion is different to diversity, not least because it's a feeling, something unique to every individual and delightfully inconsistent. Two people experiencing the same environment can feel very differently towards that environment. Take, for example, in simplest form, personality types. An extrovert is likely to feel quite at home in a vibrant environment with people around them and lots of noise, while an introvert is likely to feel quite uncomfortable in the same situation. So if we want to create more inclusive organizations, and inclusion is a feeling, and knowing that what gets measured gets done, how can we measure it? Particularly if a diverse group of people will feel differently about the same environment in which they find themselves. I'm conscious that Verna Myers' quote may be overused, but the essence of her message remains valid. And the question posed by the CIPD's definition of inclusion is a good one. Do you, irrespective of your background, identity, or circumstance, feel valued, accepted, and supported to succeed at work? Well, let's have another poll. Let's see what our audience think. Get that up, Gemma. Do you feel valued, accepted, supported to succeed at work? Okay, so 91% feel accepted, which is great. A little bit fewer feel valued, and fewer still feel supported. But generally, those scores would suggest that actually most of you are working in pretty inclusive organizations. Thanks, Gemma. We can close that off, I think. I think it'd be really interesting to know if this has changed at all since lockdown, and whether the scores have increased or decreased since we've been forced to work in isolation. And let's have another slightly different poll, but still on the subject of inclusion. You may recall that Anne Frank, who's pictured there, the CEO of the Chartered Institute of Management, created a bit of a stushy with her comments on the Radio 4 Today programme when she suggested that people should stop talking about football and cricket in the office because it wasn't being inclusive. What do you think? And I think she probably meant all sport rather than just football and cricket. So vote yes if you think that chat about sport should be banned. Vote no if you think chatting about sport in the office is okay. Yeah, I think that's rather what Anne Frank discovered from a fairly animated reaction to her commentary. Thanks, Gemma. We'll close that off. In their 2019 report, the CIPD referenced a number of different methods to measure the feeling of inclusion. And you can see from the slide how variable they all are. Getting to grips to put a hard measure around a feeling and a feeling which may vary according to different individuals' values, beliefs, and cultural upbringing, amongst other things, is clearly very challenging. Some are looking at individuals, some are looking at teams, and some at managers. So clearly, there's going to be inconsistency in how inclusion is reported. The absence of a definitive metric doesn't help, but it should not be the reason not to address the issue of inclusion in organizations. And let's be clear, let's state again, inclusivity is for everyone. It's not just for minority populations. So what does inclusive leadership look like? The Deloitte model of inclusive leadership considers 6 signature traits of inclusive leaders and a further 15 elements under each of these 6 traits, which to our mind overcomplicates the issue. Nor do we feel that these traits and elements sufficiently differentiate what inclusive leadership stands for, compared to traits and elements of effective leaders. But while we and I certainly wouldn't want to dismiss the Deloitte model, we believe that this can be simplified into a simpler, more memorable model. The ABC of inclusive leadership, where A stands for accountability, B stands for behaviors, and C stands for curiosity. And I'm going to take each of these in reverse order. The most impressive leaders I meet and work with have a relentless curiosity linked to a growth mindset. That hunger to learn, alongside a recognition and acknowledgement that they don't know it all. Bringing this curiosity into the realm of inclusive leadership, it's about understanding yourself, understanding others, and understanding their context and environment. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to stop making assumptions, be they explicit or implicit. The ancient Greek aphorism, "Know thyself," is one of the Delphic maxims, and it was inscribed in the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. We all suffer from biases, and there are a multitude. I've just listed a few here. Affinity bias is very common. How often do we say, they would fit in well to the team because they're like us, in personality or in thinking or in sense of humor? If we're more likely to favor people who are like us, what does this mean for the people who are not like us? If you are a manager and you're looking to recruit new staff, affinity bias could influence you to consider people similar to you more favorably. Most importantly, the flip side of this is you would consider people unlike you unfavorably, irrespective of their skills and abilities. Do we really seek out difference, knowing that in doing so, there could be disruption? Perception bias is another common trait, believing something about an entire group of people based on stereotypes and assumptions. Now, Google were very confused when YouTube launched their video upload feature. 5 to 10% of videos were upside down. And that was because some were shooting videos with their left hands. The bias was that right-handed people were correct, and those writing the code were probably, in the majority, all right-handed. So be curious about your own biases and understand them, because in understanding them, you can acknowledge them and take them into account in your daily life. Now, I'd really recommend the Harvard implicit bias test for people to consider how to really show up some biases. You need to try and understand what the world is like from the other person's perspective and viewpoint. How are they regarded? How might they feel? What does the world look like through their eyes? It's far too easy to make assumptions about this, and as a consequence, you really don't understand what the world looks like through a different lens. When I was at university, one of the things that able-bodied PGCE students did was to spend a day in a wheelchair to navigate their way around a university campus, trying to understand what the world was like if you couldn't walk. To a man and woman, they found it incredibly difficult, and it gave them a new outlook as to how it must be to have such a disability. By the end of the day, their views were transformed, and they had a completely new perspective on life. How often do we truly think about what life is like from a different outlook? And of course, cultural curiosity. And this is where perception bias can kick in if you consider cultural stereotyping. If you come to study in the UK from another country, you can get some guidelines on what UK culture is like from the website www.studyingintheuk.org. See if you agree with these. The British are punctual. Please, thank you, and sorry are part of everyday conversations. British rarely use superlatives and are not very animated when they speak. It is common practice to buy a round of drinks for those you came to the bar with. Now, are these typical stereotypes, or should we be challenging them and trying to really get under the skin of such stereotypes to understand who conforms to them and who doesn't? Behaviours are at the heart of inclusive leadership. Truly engaging with diversity means that you're going to get difference, so you need to be comfortable with that. We talked earlier about true diversity being cognitive or neurodiversity, so that has to be at the heart of being inclusive. You need to tease out those different views and perspectives. You have to be respectful of those differences, acknowledging them and embracing them. And as a leader, you cannot afford to let your views prevail or dominate the discussion. It's not all about you. You have a role to play as facilitator, cheerleader, and decision maker all at once, which isn't easy. And as a leader, you also have to be aware that hierarchies will impact on diverse thinking and potentially the ability to be truly inclusive. You need to be aware of another bias, groupthink, as people move towards the views of the leader. After all, if they're the leader, they must be right, mustn't they? Hierarchies also tend to foster respectfulness and deference to the leader, which can sometimes stifle inclusion through people not expressing their thoughts or views. And it's known to also limit creativity in groups. It's worth checking out Lee Thompson's work on dominance dynamics if you want to explore this further. So to be comfortable with conflict, you have to develop trust. In my experience, most teams don't take the time to accelerate the development of trust, preferring it instead to allow it to develop or not organically. This is a mistake. You can develop trust if you want and choose to. As leaders, investing time in developing trust with your colleagues and teams will be time well spent, yet it remains something that many choose to ignore. It's no surprise that in Patrick Lencioni's work on teams, an absence of trust is the foundation of dysfunctional groups. If you don't have trust, how can you expect people to offer up opinions if they cannot trust that they will either be repercussions for expressing a contrarian view, or they will be shouted down by others who have a louder voice in the group than they do? But rest assured, if you're not having some constructive conflict, you've got some issues. Things aren't being said, or you don't have a diverse team, or worst of all, you aren't being inclusive. And finally, accountability. You have to make it real. To go back to the BCG report, which emphasized a strong leadership commitment and actions. So, holding yourself and others to account is central to being more inclusive. Values and behavior statements alone pinned to walls across the organization simply won't cut it. Everyone has to walk the talk, from the CEO to the most junior and inexperienced member of the organization. But more importantly, everyone has a duty and an obligation to call out bad behaviors whenever they see them being demonstrated by whoever it is in the organization, no matter how senior they are. There was a great example on one of our podcasts when Bob Keeler, who was formerly CEO of the Wood Group, cited a fantastic example of this. Working in the oil and gas industry, safety is absolutely critical. And at the Wood Group, one of the core values and behaviors was all about accountability. Bob recounted the story about one of his more junior colleagues on an oil rig, calling him out for being on the phone and leaning over a rail, right in front of a safety sign which said that this was prohibited. He was both delighted with his colleague for calling it out and disappointed in himself that he hadn't set the right example. So you have to accept that you won't always get behaviors right. So recognize that and be prepared to learn from your mistakes. But don't let yourself or others off the hook. There is an onus on everyone to hold each other accountable. A lot of what we're talking about is about making a shift from a state of unconscious incompetence to that of conscious incompetence. Because once we get to that state, we can make some choices. To make that shift, we need greater self-awareness of our biases, our beliefs, and our behaviors, as well as flexing our curiosity muscle. We need to be able to understand what options there are to become more inclusive, how we need to adapt and change our behaviors, which may often have served us well in the past, to become more engaging, more tolerant of views that don't converge or sit well with our own, and to ensure that we have true cognitive diversity at play in our teams and groups that we interact with or lead. Now, hopefully, with the right support and guidance, you can make that shift in behavior. Coaching can help, particularly when it's supported with some mechanisms to raise self-awareness, such as 360s. Understanding your blind spots and biases is central to becoming consciously incompetent. And it will take some courage to embark on that journey. You may have to expose yourself and your limitations to a coach, which isn't always a comfortable thing to do. Investing time to build trust explicitly in your leadership teams so that you can nurture and encourage all of those different views and perspectives so that they're expressed in a safe and trusting environment. Then as leaders and leadership teams, role modeling those behaviors, which not only encourage inclusion, but more importantly, hold each other to account when it isn't happening. Mentoring is also a good technique and process to deploy, encouraging leaders to truly reflect on their own leadership approach as they guide others on their emerging leadership journeys. There's considerable evidence that often the most impactful form of mentoring is reverse mentoring, and I can speak from personal experience in this regard as I have my own reverse mentor. There is nothing more illuminating than having a light shone on your own values, beliefs, and leadership style from someone who experiences it daily. Similarly, other types of programs and unconscious bias training are all valuable interventions to consider. But beware, there is no single solution to create an inclusive organization which benefits from inclusive leaders. The solutions will vary according to your business, your organization's maturity, your context, and your colleagues and leaders. While taking a shotgun approach may seem appropriate and start to shift the needle on the dial, we would strongly advocate taking a more focused approach. Choosing the right intervention for the right people is key. And again, accept that you probably won't get it right first time. Start small, perhaps with a pilot program, and then think about how you might roll it out, if indeed it has proved to be effective. It is a marathon, not a sprint. Cultural change takes time, usually much more time than leaders, who are often impatient, might imagine. Again, to go back to the BCG report, they talked about a focus on implementation, exemplified by strong leadership commitment and actions tailored to drive change, balancing top-down and bottom-up initiatives. You need to take a holistic approach across the whole organization and be targeted with your investment, be that an investment of time or money, to get the best possible return. We know that inclusion and diversity is good for business, but more importantly, it's good for society and humanity. What we hope we've done is to have thrown some light onto the issues, to have given you all some food for thought, and to have prompted some ideas for further discussion with you.
I'd like to finish up by thanking all of you for sharing your lunch hour with us, and thank you for all of your great questions as well. Thank you, David, for a thought-provoking and entertaining presentation today.
My pleasure.
And I really enjoy using the ABC framework and just reflecting on that curiosity aspect. I do think that we need to be careful not to punish ourselves for having unconscious biases, because our brains process a huge amount of data subconsciously that our conscious brains just couldn't manage. So the important thing is, like you said, that we're curious and that we challenge our assumptions and thought processes in a very deliberate way. Lots of food for thought there. So if you'd like to continue the conversation with us offline, as you can see, our contact details are available there. And I'll also be emailing you probably earlier next week with a link to watch back the recording as well. So thanks again, have a great weekend and stay in touch.